How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Tuesday, Yom Shlishi. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? On a Tuesday, Yehudit in South Carolina, Stephen in Maine, Carla in Brazil, Paula in Chicago, and Shandora in the Bronx, Bella in Florida, Nancy in North Carolina, John in Maine, Guy in Ohio, David in Indiana, Renee in Indiana. Marjorie says shalom. Aoife in Florida. Special shout out to our pal Mickey Stein in New Jersey. Bill in mid-Missouri. Hey everybody, our daf today is page 23 here in Tractate Kiddushin, the 20th volume of the Talmud. We are continuing our discussion of Mishna number 3 in chapter 1. We picked this up somewhat near the bottom of page 22b. Hold on a second, let me get set up here. Okay, so Mishna number 3 concerns the Canaanite slave, how he was acquired when this kind of slavery existed, when slavery existed in Israel in the ancient world, how the Canaanite slave was acquired, and how he went free. The sages taught in the Tosefta 1:5. How does one acquire a slave through possession? This is a means of acquisition, right? A kinyan is an act of acquisition. Acquire, right? To be kona, to be. Hebrew grammar is just so different than American grammar that, you know, when you're in circles, you know, somewhat yeshivish circles, you say, I'm not going to get into that. At any rate, you know, sometimes the way Hebrew works is instead of the verb to acquire something, the way it's actually worded is you are the acquirer, right? And so you might you say to be kone, right? To be acquiring or to be the acquirer. At any rate, let me just get that set. Right, and so like as I was mentioning yesterday, you know, that when God, it's often translated in the daily prayer as the one who creates the world. One of the phrases where it's said about God that he creates the world, what it actually says is that he acquires the world. And so, you know, acquiring is not just like, you know, purchasing. It means also entering into relationship with. And as we saw with a slave, and we'll see this even continuing today, there was definitely a distinction made between the Hebrew slave and the Canaanite slave, right? So the Hebrew slave is like your brother who has either fallen on very hard times or got himself into trouble by becoming a thief and not being able to pay back. And so he enters 6 years of servitude, then he comes out, unless he chooses to stay in, which the sages definitely limited his ability to do that, so he shouldn't do that. Now, the Canaanite slave is not your brother, as it were. Right? The Canaanite slave was from among the Canaanite people, and so that was a different kind of slave, right? That was a slavery forever, right? A Canaanite slave was inheritable property. Nonetheless, we're going to talk about today sort of the relationship even between the Canaanite slave and the master is complicated, right? Is complicated, and especially when we think about that when the Torah came into the world and granted not only rights, you know, to a fellow Jew who is temporarily in the position of a slave, but even to the Canaanite slave, you know, which would be much more comparable to the way slavery was practiced throughout the ancient world, even the Canaanite slave received rights. But not only did the Canaanite slave receive rights, we'll see over the course of today's discussion that perhaps because the Canaanite slave had certain rights, in that part of the world, you know, the Canaanite slave also might not want to go free because it was better for him. Now, where the sages, some sages will say it might be better for him, and so you can't accept his release on his behalf without him agreeing to it. He has to consent to be freed. Other sages will say he doesn't have to consent because it's better for him to be free. So even even the sages of the Gemara had a dispute about that. But all of which is to say that, we can't look at slavery as it was practiced in the ancient world through the eye, through the lens of the modern eye. Okay. The sages taught, how does one acquire a slave through possession? If the slave removes the master's shoe, or he carries his garments after him to the bathhouse, or undresses him, or bathes him, or anoints him, or scrubs the oil off of him, or dresses him, or puts on his shoes, or lifts him, the master acquires him. In other words, if the slave serves the master as a slave would, this is understood to be possession. It's not that you're hugging him, right? It's that he enters your service and starts acting like a slave. Then that is possession. So Rabbi Shimon says acquisition through the mode of possession should not be considered greater than acquisition using the mode of lifting, as lifting acquires property in any situation. Right, so as we've talked about before, this formal act of acquisition, we're sort of not used to this concept. Right, we normally say you go into a store, you put your money on the counter. If the seller picks up the money, the item is yours. But no, under Jewish law, under halacha, that item doesn't become yours, even if you put the money on the table and the seller picks up the money, but the item itself hasn't entered your possession. You haven't formally acquired it until you do one of these acts of formal acquisition. Now, one of them would be lifting it, right? So having put the money, now it's by agreement between you and the seller that when you lift it, then it becomes yours. Until you've lifted it, right? Let's say shoplifters come in, robbers, and stick up the owner of the establishment and rob that item off the counter. If the buyer hasn't formally acquired it yet and the seller took the money, then the seller is going to have to provide a replacement item, or they can undo the deal, right? Because that item has not yet entered the buyer's possession, right? So lifting is one of those modes of acquisition. So Rabbi Shimon says, with regard to all property, if you're able to lift it, that's a viable and perfectly good and one of the best forms of acquisition, because everybody can see it. There could be witnesses there. The buyer lifted it. It became his. So can you do this with a slave? What would that even mean? Do you actually literally have to pick the slave up? I mean, if you're acquiring a Canaanite minor, like a small slave, a child, okay, understandable, but if it's a big slave, you're going to have a lot of trouble lifting him. What does it mean? So Rabbi Shimon says acquisition through the mode of possession should not be considered greater than acquisition using the mode of lifting, as lifting acquires property in any situation. With regard to this last statement, the Gemara asks, what is Rabbi Shimon saying here? The first Tana also said that a slave can be acquired by lifting. Lifting was included in the list, like that the slave could serve you, or if you lift the slave, then he enters, your possession. Then you formally acquired him. So why is Rabbi Shimon mentioning lifting as if it wasn't included in that list? So Rav Ashi says that one can infer from the statement of the first Tana, if a slave lifts his master, the master acquires him, right? The lifting was mentioned in a list of actions that the slave performs for the master, so that he can be said to have formally entered the service of the master. Who's talking about the master lifting the slave? Right, so if the slave lifts the master acquires him as he is performing labor for the master. But if his master lifts the slave, the master does not acquire him, as the slave has not performed labor for the master. Right? The master lifts the slave, carries him across the street so he doesn't get his feet dirty in a puddle. You can't say that the slave served the master. With regard to this, Rabbi Shimon says acquisition through possession should not be greater than acquisition through lifting, as lifting acquires property in any situation. Consequently, one can acquire a slave even by lifting him. You could say that the slave is not serving the master when the master lifts the slave, but lifting is a form of acquiring property that, according to Rabbi Shimon, would work even here. Let me just remember to mention that tomorrow's class, tomorrow, Wednesday, will be at the regular Friday time, right? At noon Pacific, because Nina and I are going to a wedding tomorrow night. I didn't want to cancel class, so we're going to have class tomorrow at noon. Special time, tomorrow, Wednesday, noon Pacific. Also, if you subscribe to the Accidental Talmudist weekly email, which if you haven't, you should, because there's always two beautiful pieces of Torah there, humor, all links to all of the week's classes, a meme, all kinds of good stuff. But also, we published the holiday schedule. Okay, so which days during the holidays, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot, we published the holiday schedule. Generally, we're going to go on as we always do. But Rosh Hashanah is 2 days. It starts on Friday, so Friday noon we'll have a class. Saturday night we won't. Sunday night the 17th we will. Bill Eldridge, I know you're curious about that. So we will have a class on Sunday night the 17th. But at any rate, we'll publish that schedule on Facebook. But you should subscribe to the Accidental Talmudist email, and you can sign up for that at accidentaltalmudist.org. Okay. So the Gemara asks, now that you said that if a slave lifts his master, the master acquires him, as this is one of the forms of serving the master, so consider the following ramification of this ruling, if that is so. This is crazy. Let a Canaanite maidservant be acquired by means of sexual intercourse with the master, as it is possible to claim that she lifts him during the act of intercourse. Sort of imagining a kind of standard position. The Gemara answers, when we say that one acquires a slave through the labor that the slave performs for him, that applies to a situation where the master benefits and the slave suffers. In other words, the slave puts out, right? The slave is doing the work for the master's benefit. So in this manner, the master exercises his authority over the slave. Here, with regard to sexual intercourse between, a Jewish master and a Canaanite maidservant, this is a case where the master benefits and the Canaanite maidservant likewise benefits, since both sides derive benefit, meaning the pleasure they derive from intercourse. So you could not use that act, which, by the way, is prohibited anyway, but you couldn't use that act as an act of acquisition under the theory that she is lifting him. And so the Gemara asks, well, what if he engages in intercourse in an atypical manner? Do we understand the euphemism whenever the Talmud refers to sexual intercourse in the atypical manner? Does it need to be said? Figure it out. With her. So if they have intercourse in an atypical manner with her, then what can be said? In that case, the woman does not benefit from the intercourse. The assumption being that if you do it from the other way, she would not enjoy the intercourse the way he would. So Rav Achai bar Ada of the place called Acha said, who will tell us, i.e., it is not obvious that there is no benefit for both of them, i.e. there is benefit, i.e. how can you say that there's benefit only for the man when they engage in intercourse in an atypical manner? In other words, he's saying, how can you say that no woman enjoys that? Maybe the woman does enjoy that. And furthermore, it is written, lyings with a woman, or the love-makings of a woman, or the copulations of a woman, which is Leviticus 18:22, right, where it's referred to the copulations of a woman, plural, and that plural form indicates that there are two ways of engaging in sexual intercourse with a woman, right, two passageways. And in this manner, the verse compares typical sexual intercourse to atypical sexual intercourse, meaning that both are considered sexual intercourse. So how can you say that, the woman would not benefit in some way? Therefore, the point being that whether they engage in regular intercourse or atypical intercourse, if a Hebrew master and a Canaanite maidservant engage in this prohibited copulation, prohibited simply because they're not married, and she's not Jewish and he can't marry her anyway. But nevertheless, the point is, in terms of the act itself, since they both derive pleasure from it, this would not be considered a mode of her serving him. Now you could say, well, if he orders her to do it and she does it, and she might not want to do it at all, isn't that a way of her serving him? But they're not exploring that question, right? They're saying, okay, interesting question that you raised, but that is not included in the list of ways of acquiring a Canaanite maidservant by what we call possession, meaning that she serves him in the in the way that a slave normally serves a master, meaning doing chores, doing work for him. Did I finish that? Yeah, I finished that. Okay, moving on. The Gemara relates, Rabbi Yehuda from India was a convert who had no heirs, right? So we discussed this before. When somebody converts to Judaism, legally speaking, his parents or her parents are understood to be Abraham and Sarah, the mother and father of the Jewish people. So they're considered, Ben Avraham, Ben Sarah, or, Bat Avraham, Bat Sarah, the son of Abraham and Sarah, the daughter of Abraham and Sarah. Okay, so if they do not then, marry a Jewish woman and have children who would be considered their heirs, but rather if this person didn't, once he converted or she converted, did not have children, right, within their life as a Jew, then when they die, because their family associations are legally broken, they're obviously perfectly permitted and encouraged to maintain a loving relationship with their relatives, but those relatives, from a legal standpoint, are not considered the inheritors, the heirs of this person who converted. Why is this being brought up here? Because if what part of the property that this person has is a Canaanite slave, so who inherits the slave, right? There are no heirs, so what happens to the slave? That's what's being asked. So the Gemara relates, Rabbi Yehuda from India was a convert who had no heirs. When he became ill, Marzutra entered to ask about his health. And when he saw that Rabbi Yehuda's condition intensified, i.e. that he was about to die, Marzutra said to Rabbi Yehuda's slave, remove my shoes and take them to my house. And what did he do by that? He acquired the slave. He wanted to acquire the slave upon the death of his master, as when a convert without heirs dies, the first person, the first Jew, to claim his property acquires it, right? Because it's considered ownerless property since he had no heirs. And the Gemara comments, there are those who say that this slave was an adult man, and in this version, Rabbi Yehuda from India departed to death, and that individual, Marzutra, departed to life by receiving a slave. And there are those who say that the slave in this incident was a minor, and Marzutra did not act in accordance with the opinion of Abba Shaul, as it is taught in a Baraisa with regard to a convert who dies without heirs, and Jews descend on his property because it is considered ownerless, and among his possessions were slaves. Then, whether the slaves were adults or minors, they acquire ownership of themselves and become free men, as they can acquire themselves from the ownerless property. Right, so the Canaanite slave whose master dies and has no heirs, the Canaanite slave acquires himself and goes free. Right? Another case where, believe me, that was not the case outside of the Torah world. In Rome, if somebody was a slave and his master died, somebody would jump on that slave and take him for himself. Maybe the guy could get away because people didn't know, but more likely somebody would take that slave for himself. Right, so Abba Shaul says adult slaves acquire ownership of themselves and become free men. But with regard to minor slaves, anyone who takes possession of them acquires them. So according to the opinion of Abba Shaul, Marzutra did not have to hasten to acquire the slave during Rabbi Yehuda's lifetime before the slave would acquire himself. He could have waited until Rabbi Yehuda died before acquiring the slave. Now, new subject. The Mishna teaches that a slave can acquire himself by means of money. And Rabbi Meir rules that his money must be given by others. So the Gemara comments, the ruling indicates that with money given by others, yes, the slave can be freed in this manner, but not by giving money himself. Why? Because a Canaanite slave has no independent identity from his master. Anything that belongs to the Canaanite slave belongs to his master. So if the Canaanite slave somehow got his hands on some money, that money belongs to his master and he can't use it to purchase his freedom. But if he could convince somebody else to purchase him for, and free him, that would be permissible. So the Gemara comes. The ruling indicates that with money given by others, yes, the slave can be freed in this manner, but not by giving money himself. And the Gemara asks, with what are we dealing? If we say that this is referring to emancipating the Canaanite slave without his consent, that creates a difficulty. After all, we have heard that Rabbi Meir is the one who says it is against the slave's interest to leave his master's authority for freedom, as he thereby loses out on certain benefits. And we learned in a Baraisa, one can act in a person's interest in his absence, but one can act against a person's interest only in his presence. How can one act against the slave's interest and free him without his consent, right? Now, this was not Rabbi Meir, making a sophistry and saying, well, come on, it's much better for a Canaanite slave to be enslaved to a Jewish master. He wouldn't want to go free, would he? It's not the sort of argument that was made about tragically American slavery in the South, that it somehow benefited the slaves. Rabbi Meir is being serious. So what could he mean? So first of all, the idea is that if there were certain advantages for the Canaanite slave to be enslaved, then if you want him to go free, if you want to create a situation where he goes free, he has to consent to it. Now, if he consents to it, no problem. Maybe he's going to be thrilled to go free, but you just have to get his permission before you arrange for him to go free. And then the underlying question, what could be an advantage to the Canaanite slave? You could ask, how did he end up in slavery in the first place? You could certainly say there's an advantage to being a Canaanite slave in a Hebrew household than, to be a slave in an, Algerian galley ship, right? Where you row all day and all night until you die. But more to the point, sort of formally, legally speaking, it was that Canaanite slaves were obligated in certain mitzvahs, right? Had the opportunity and even the obligation to perform certain commandments, unlike Noahides, right? The whole world is obligated in the Noahide commandments. Jews are obligated in the 613 commandments that Jews are obligated under, and the Canaanite slave was somewhere in between, right? And so, and he might have been serving in, a very prominent position. I mean, you think of like the way that Joseph was enslaved in Potiphar's house, that was a pretty good position, as Joseph said in Genesis. My master has given me everything, allowed me to supervise everything. I'm in charge of everything except his own wife. That's the only thing he hasn't given to me. So you can imagine that Joseph, as a slave in Potiphar's house, I mean, he was a very VIP type of position with a lot of people working and answering to him. So a Canaanite slave might have ended up in a position like that, and you can't just take it away from him. As a ploy, right? Like maybe imagine that some, Jewish slave owner in ancient times had a Canaanite slave, was very clever, very good at running things, and was rewarding him and setting him up in a nice home and giving him supervision of a big business, etc. And the owner had a friend, who wanted to get that job for himself or become partners, And so what he does is he just, gives some money to the owner and frees the slave, kind of convinces the owner when he's drunk, oh, you should free your slave. Here, I'll pay you for him. Or sell him to me, and somehow gets away with it, but the slave was never consulted. So Rabbi Meir is saying you cannot do that, right? That's another one of the rights that the Canaanite slave had. So you can't act against his interest without his consent, right? As opposed to, if somebody comes to me and says, hey, your neighbor is out of the house. I want to leave him a gift, very nice gift. Can I just give it to you and you'll give it to him? So can I accept that gift on behalf of my neighbor? My neighbor doesn't know. He didn't appoint me as his agent to receive that gift. But if the gift only benefits him, So sure, I could accept it on behalf of my neighbor because I know he would want me to receive it for him so that he can get it to him. That's a sort of agency where there's pure benefit. But if there's any nuance of it where maybe it's not such a good thing for me to receive the gift for him because he's actually going to be away for 3 weeks, and it would be better if the gift simply gets returned and it's going to be stored at the post office, and he would prefer that. So if there's any element that it might not be totally advantageous, then I can't become his agent without his knowledge and consent. So rather, it is obvious that this slave was freed with his consent, and the Mishnah teaches us the following. With money given by others, yes, the slave can be freed in this manner, but by giving money himself, no, he cannot be freed in this manner despite his consent. Why? Because he doesn't own the money. Everything he owns belongs to his master. So evidently, a slave has no acquisition without his master. It is impossible for a slave to perform an independent act of acquisition, as everything acquired by him immediately belongs to his master. Consequently, he cannot be in possession of money with which he can acquire himself. Instead, the money must be given to his owner by somebody else. So the Gemara asks, if so, say the latter clause of the Mishnah, he can be freed by means of a bill of manumission if he accepts it by himself. So the Gemara analyzes this ruling, right? So the slave can't possess money, so he can't use money that's somehow in his possession to buy his freedom. Somebody else has to give it to the master for him. Can the slave receive the bill of manumission? The master just wants to free him by means of a document. Can the slave receive his own bill of manumission? On the one hand, you could say, well, anything he receives belongs to his master. So even if the master gives him a bill of manumission, he doesn't own that document because anything he receives belongs to his master, even if it comes from his master. On the other hand, a bill of manumission, which frees the slave, maybe the moment that it's placed in his hand, simultaneously frees him, and therefore he's able to accept that document of manumission, and he does become free. That would be the two sides of the argument. Evidently, where am I? He can be freed by means of a bill of manumission if he accepts it by himself. And the Gemara analyzes this. If he accepts it by himself, yes. But if it is accepted by others, no. Right? Interesting. He can receive the bill of manumission from his master, but others can't. Others can buy his freedom. He cannot buy his own freedom. Others can buy it for him. But he can receive his own document of manumission. Others cannot receive it for him. And if this document is produced with the slave's consent, as claimed above, why is it not effective if it is accepted by others? And the Gemara adds, and if, you would say in response, what is the meaning of if he accepts it by himself? This means that in addition to being freed, if the bill of manumission is accepted by others, he can also be freed if he accepts it by himself. And according to this interpretation, the Mishnah teaches us this, that his bill of manumission and his ability to acquire himself, meaning to his freedom, come simultaneously. In other words, although he did not have the legal power to acquire himself with money while he was still a slave, when he receives a bill of manumission, he attains this ability at that same moment, and therefore the ability to receive the document and be free. The Gemara explains why this interpretation of the Mishnah is problematic. But Rabbi Meir did not teach this ruling. As it is taught in a Baraisa, a slave can be freed by means of a bill of manumission if he accepts it by himself, but not if it is accepted by others. This is the statement of Rabbi Meir. Abaye said, actually, according to Rabbi Meir, the Mishnah is referring to a case where the master received money without the slave's consent. An acquisition effected with the giving of money is different, since it acquires him against his will from another master, as the slave's consent is not necessary in that case, right? A master can sell his slave to another master, so it likewise acquires him for himself against his will. His consent is not required, despite the fact that it is against his interest to be freed, according to Rabbi Meir. So the Gemara asks, if so, that the law that a slave can be freed with the giving of money without his consent is predicated on the law that he can be acquired by means of giving the money to his previous master without his consent, he should also be freed with a document if it is accepted by others without his consent. And the Gemara answers, this document is discrete and this document is discrete. You can't compare them because they're different things. The comparison between the acquisition of a slave by one master from another. And his emancipation, we can't make that comparison in the case of a document. Why? Because a document of sale is not similar to a document of manumission. The Gemara asks here too, this money is discrete and this money is discrete, as the money given for a different purpose in the cases of acquisition and manumission. Right? One master purchases a slave from another master. The other is that somebody gives the master money to free the slave. Those are different cases. So the Gemara answers, well, in any event, the coin itself is one, i.e. there's no noticeable difference between the coin used for acquisition of a slave and the coin that would be used for emancipating him. The same cannot be said with regard to documents, as particular texts serve specific purposes, and the same document could not be used for both acquiring a slave and for emancipating him. So Rav has said the following distinction. With regard to emancipation by means of money, his master's receipt of the money causes him to be freed, not the giving of money by others. Therefore, they are not considered to have harmed the slave without his consent. By contrast, in the case of a document, the receipt of the document by others on behalf of the slave causes him to be freed, and one can incur liability for another person only in his presence, right? In other words, they need his consent. He has to know that he's being freed and agree to it. They can't do that without his knowledge or consent. The Mishna teaches the slave's consent. The Mishna teaches, and the rabbis say, the slave can be freed by means of money given by himself. So the Gemara analyzes this ruling. By means of money given by himself, yes, he can be emancipated in this manner. But with money given by others, no, he cannot be emancipated in this manner. It's the opposite of what we just said before. We said others can pay to have him freed because they own the money that's being given to the master. But he can't give money to his master because everything he owns is already owned by his master. Now this is saying the opposite. He can buy his freedom with money that he gives to the master, but others cannot do that. Why would we have the opposite ruling? The Gemara asks, why not? Although this was indeed performed without the slave's consent, after all, we heard that the rabbis say it is in a slave's interest to go out from the master's authority to freedom. Now we're seeing Rabbi Meir says it's in the slave's interest to remain enslaved, even a Canaanite slave. But the rabbis, the majority, disagree with Rabbi Meir. They're like, no, it's always better to be free. Whether you're a Hebrew slave or a Canaanite slave, it's better to be free. And we learned in a Baraisa, one can act in a person's interest in his absence, but one can act against a person's interest only in his presence. So if we start with the assumption that it is better to be free, okay, then anybody should be able to give the master money and tell him, free your slave, and whether the slave agrees or not, the slave goes free. And if you would say, what is the meaning of the phrase, by means of money given by himself? This means that not only can he be redeemed by means of money given to others, I guess to give his master, but he can be redeemed even by means of money given to himself. That somebody could give him money and say, use this money to purchase your freedom from your master, and this would work. And it teaches us that a slave has the ability to receive an acquisition without his master. In other words, now we're saying, no, your assumption before was wrong. A slave is able to possess money that does not belong to his master, and he could use that to purchase his freedom. If so, the latter clause of the Mishnah, he can be freed by means of a bill of manumission if it is accepted by others. This indicates if it is accepted by others, but not if he accepts it by himself. And yet we maintain that according to the rabbis, his bill of manumission and his ability to acquire his freedom come simultaneously. If so, why can't he be freed through a document that he accepts by himself? He takes the bill of manumission that the master is offering him. Why not? Why would that not work? And if you would say, what is the meaning of it is accepted by others? This means that not only can he be emancipated if he accepts the bill of manumission himself, but he can even be freed if others accept it on his behalf. And the Mishnah teaches us this, that it is in a slave's interest to go out from the master's authority to freedom. And that is the law. If so, there is no difference between emancipation by means of money and emancipation by means of a document. And therefore, let us combine them and teach them together. And we should simply say, a slave can be freed by means of money and by means of a bill of manumission, whether by himself receiving the bill or paying the money, or others receiving the bill on his behalf or paying the money on his behalf. Either way, if the master agrees to it, the slave can go free. So rather, it is clear that there is a difference between money and a document, because that's not the way our Mishnah is worded. When he is emancipated by means of money, a slave can be freed whether by means of money given by others or whether by means of money given by himself. In the case of a bill of manumission, he can be emancipated if it is accepted by others, but not if he accepts it by himself. And this latter clause is the opinion of Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. As it is taught in a Baraisa, that Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says a slave can also be freed with a bill of manumission if it is accepted by others, but not if he accepts it himself. And there are 3 disputes with regard to this matter. There are the opinions of Rabbi Meir, the rabbis, the majority, and Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, as we shall explain. Rabbah said, what is the reason of Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar? He derives this by means of a verbal analogy, understanding the meaning of the word la, meaning to her, written with regard to a Hebrew maidservant in the verse, nor was he freed and given to her, Leviticus 19:30, and from the meaning in a different verse of the same word, la, meaning for her, which was written with regard to a wife in the laws of divorce at Deuteronomy 24:3. Just as a woman is not divorced until the husband moves the bill of divorce, the get, from his domain into a domain that is not his, and the bill of divorce is ineffective as long as it remains in his domain, he has to give it to her. So too, a slave is not freed unless the master moves the bill of manumission to a domain that is not his. Since the slave belongs to him, the document will remain the master's even if he gives it to the slave. Therefore, he can be freed by means of a document only through other people acting as the agent of the slave and receiving the bill of manumission on his behalf. And this actually shows you that although we use the words acquire when we say, that a man acquires a woman when a husband marries a wife, but he's able to give her the get directly to her, right? Even according to Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. But a slave, a master cannot, according to this view, give the bill of manumission to the slave. Why? Because the slave is his property. So he can't receive something because anything he gets belongs to his master. Whereas a wife can receive the get from the husband, so her status, obviously, is not one of property, but that's just a formal proof of that. Rabbi raises a dilemma. Now we're on 23b. According to the opinion of Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, in the case of a Canaanite slave, what is the law with regard to the possibility that a slave can appoint an agent to accept his bill of manumission from the hand of his master? Does one say that since Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar derives the verbal analogy of la and la from a woman, which teaches that a slave can be freed with a document, therefore a slave is also like a woman in that he too can appoint an agent, right? She can receive the get from her husband, or she can appoint an agent to receive the get from her husband. She doesn't have to go and see the husband if she doesn't want to. Or perhaps in the case of a woman, as she can accept her get herself, she can also appoint an agent, whereas a slave is different. Since he, according to Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, cannot accept his bill of manumission himself, consequently, he cannot appoint an agent either. After raising the dilemma, Rabbah subsequently resolved it. Since Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar derives the verbal analogy of lot and lot from a woman, a slave is also treated like a woman with regard to his ability to appoint an agent. So he could appoint an agent. So the Gemara comments, but consider that which Rav Huna, the son of Rabbi Yehoshua, says with regard to the service in the temple. These priests, right, the Kohanim, the priests who serve in the holy temple when the temple was standing, these priests are agents of the merciful one, i.e. they perform the temple service as the emissaries of God. Whoa. Don't we think that the priests who bring the daily sacrifice and who bring our sacrifices when the temple is standing, and people would bring a guilt offering or a sin offering or a thanksgiving offering or a peace offering, right? We can't bring those offerings up to the altar ourselves. We have to hand it to a priest and they bring it up for us. So isn't the priest acting as an agent of the Jewish people, bringing those sacrifices? But this is saying, no, the priests were acting as agents of the Lord in bringing those sacrifices. Why is that? As if it enters your mind that the priests who served in the temple were acting as our agents, is there anything that we cannot do ourselves, but an agent can do on our behalf? Since it is prohibited for non-priests to serve in the temple, priests cannot be considered the agents of the Jewish people. Is that right? Is there something that I'm not permitted to do myself? Can I have another Jew, or in this case a priest, do it for me? I cannot bring a sacrifice on the altar. Can I ask a priest to do it for me? Is he acting as my agent, or is he acting as the Lord's agent? Well, this statement leads to the following question. But is it not true that an agent can be appointed to perform a task that cannot be done by the one who sent him? According to Rabbi's conclusion, there is the case of a slave who is unable to accept his own bill of manumission because everything he's in his possession is really in the possession of his master, and yet he can appoint an agent to receive it for him. The Gemara rejects this suggestion. No, that is not so. The difference between the cases is that an Israelite is not involved in the laws of offerings at all, as a non-priest is never permitted to sacrifice offerings. By contrast, a slave is somewhat involved in bills of manumission, as it is taught in a Baraisa. It seems that a slave can accept the bill of manumission of another slave, provided that it is from the hand of the master of that other slave and not their joint master, right? Like a slave of what this, the two slaves have the same master. One slave cannot receive the bill of manumission on behalf of the other because both slaves, anything that they hold on to belongs to that master. But if two slaves have two different masters, one slave can receive the other's bill of manumission, the other slave's bill of manumission from that other master on his behalf, and that agency would work. So therefore, slaves are not entirely precluded from functioning in the law of bills of manumission, unlike every non-priest who is entirely prohibited from doing anything in the temple that has to do with bringing sacrifices. Now, with regard to the issue at hand, since a slave can accept a bill of manumission, at least on behalf of another slave, the laws of these documents are relevant to him, and therefore he can appoint an agent to receive his bill of manumission, which is dissimilar to the case of the priest, so they're not comparable. So the Mishna teaches that according to Rabbi Meir, and by the way, then they move off the question of whether priests act as our agents or God's agents. The reason being, it's not really a relevant question, right? They're just doing their job. Their job is to bring the offerings of the Jewish people for God. They act as intermediaries, not as agents. So the Mishnah teaches that according to Rabbi Meir, the slave can be freed by means of money given by others, while the rabbis hold that he can be freed by means of money given by himself, provided that the money he gives belongs to others and not to his master. So the Gemara suggests, shall we say that they disagree with regard to this principle, and that Rabbi Meir maintains there is no acquisition for a slave without his master, i.e. a slave has no personal property, and therefore his master immediately owns whatever the slave acquires, which means a slave cannot receive his redemption money himself. Somebody wants to buy his freedom for him, has to give that money to the master directly, not to the slave in order to give to his master to have himself freed. And similarly, there is no acquisition for a woman without her husband. And the rabbis maintain there is acquisition for a slave without his master, and there is acquisition for a woman without her husband. It's not that everything the slave owns belongs to his master. That is not the case. Just like not everything that a wife owns belongs to her husband. Rabbi said that Rav Sheshes said, everyone agrees that there is no acquisition for a slave without his master. And there is no acquisition for a woman without her husband. And so with what are we dealing here? Right? According to one view, not the other. But according to this view, this is a unique case in which another individual transferred 100 dinars to a slave and said to him, I am giving you this money on the condition that your master has no rights to it. Now the Gemara clarifies the two opinions according to this explanation. Rabbi Meir would say that when this third party said to the Canaanite slave, acquire the money, the slave acquires it, and his master immediately acquires it, meaning the condition, take this money on the condition that it belongs to you and not your master. The condition is meaningless because nothing that a slave owns doesn't belong to his master. Everything a slave owns does belong to his master. So Rabbi Meir would say when somebody gives him the money and says on condition that your master doesn't acquire it, the condition is meaningless. Therefore, the money that was given to the slave immediately belongs to the master. And when he said to him on the condition that your master has no rights in it, he has said nothing. The condition is ineffective. But the rabbis, meaning the majority who disagree and overrule Rabbi Meir, maintain that since this third party said to the slave, on the condition, his condition is effective, and the master does not acquire the money. Therefore, the slave owns the money himself, and with it, he can purchase his own freedom. And Rabbi Lazar said, in a case like this, everyone agrees that the slave acquires the money, and his master automatically acquires that which was acquired by the slave. And with what are we dealing here in the dispute between the sages and Rabbi Meir? This is referring to a case where another person transferred 100 dinars to him and said to him, on the condition, not that your master has no rights in the money, but rather I am transferring you this money on the condition that you are emancipated with it. Ah, interesting, right? So Rabbi Lazar is saying, no, everything that the slave owns, he owns on behalf of the master. He doesn't have any of his own personal possessions. But I'm giving him this money as the master's agent and saying, and the master would have to agree, obviously, and saying, oh, I'm giving you this money so that the slave is emancipated with it, right? And so this would be against the interest of the master. He has to agree to it. Can't be done without his consent. But in that situation, you could technically hand the money to the slave. It becomes the master's, and it's just a flow through so that the master gets the money, and with it, the slave goes free. His emancipation has been purchased. So the Gemara explains the dispute according to this interpretation. I'm almost done, very close. Questions or comments, get them in now. The Gemara explains the dispute according to this interpretation. Rabbi Meir maintains that when he said to him, acquire the money, the slave acquires it, and his master immediately acquires the 100 dinars from him. And when he said to him, on the condition, he has said nothing to him. And the rabbis maintain he does not transfer the money to the slave himself, as he said to him only on the condition that you are emancipated with it. In other words, this third party gave it to the slave only for him to hand over the money to his master so that he could be emancipated. Therefore, the condition is valid and the slave is emancipated, and the law is according to the majority who overrule Rabbi Meir. I'm going to take some questions and comments. Reminder, tomorrow's class, abnormal time, noon Pacific, like we do on Fridays, but tomorrow, Wednesday, the class is at noon Pacific because Nina and I are, thank God, going to a wedding tomorrow night. Tremendous simcha, tremendous joy. My good friend Josh, his daughter is getting married, and we are going to be so happy to celebrate with him. And we're going to be gone from the early afternoon. So, tomorrow's class, noon Pacific. Sharon asks, I remain unable to understand why a slave is unable to accept his own bill of manumission. A woman is divorced as soon as she receives a get. Wouldn't one assume that as soon as the slave gets the bill of manumission in his or her hands, he or she would be free? I think, Sharon, that you're right, and that is the law. It's just that we were saying, according to the minority view, that he's not able to accept the bill of manumission. It's because everything belongs to the master, and so somebody else should accept his bill of manumission for him. But the law, the halacha, is like you're saying. Let me just confirm that. I'm sure that he receives his own bill of manumission. Yeah. If a master gives his slave in the presence of two witnesses a document which states that he is a free man, or if the document was signed by two witnesses and the master gives it to him privately, the slave is emancipated. So he is able to receive his own bill of manumission, just as you said. We were only talking about, with regard to the minority view that disagrees with that idea. But you understood it correctly. That is the law. Joseph, what is the difference between an agent and an intermediary? Right, so, an intermediary is just somebody that is necessary in order to, perform some kind of activity. right? He's not your agent. An agent is somebody that you appoint to do something for you, and within the limits of the agency, he has stepped into your shoes and he is acting as you, right? Whereas, if the case of the priest in the temple, if I say, here's my sin offering, okay, he's not bringing the sin offering on my behalf as my agent. It's just that I've completed my task, which is to bring the animal to the temple, hand it over in the right way. I've completed my part of the process. Now he takes over and he does his part of the process. So my, expiation, let's say, my atonement, if I'm bringing a sin offering, won't be complete until, he slaughters the animal, sprinkles its blood on the corners of the altar, eats a certain part of it. So his role is necessary, but he's not my agent in that. That's the difference between an agent and an intermediary. A couple of off-topic questions. I guess people are talking about cigars and vaping. Very interesting. Definitely recommend Googling this question because it's there's more nuance to it. A cigar is not something you eat, right? It's more akin to a fragrance that you inhale. So I don't know that there's such a thing as a cigar that is not kosher. I don't know. Maybe there is. I don't know what if it had some aspect. I don't know what would render cigar not kosher, but I can tell you that in my neck of the woods, and the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jews that I hang out with, cigars are very much enjoyed. So I don't think there's any problem from a religious perspective. Now, some might argue that, if it was definitively proven that, cigars cause cancer or something, that they're very harmful to you, then you would be violating the principle of taking care of, this body that God entrusted, to you for the purpose of carrying your soul through this world. And you do have a duty, to take care of your health. And so that could cause problems. But I'm not aware of any ruling that would say that a cigar is not kosher. Moshe Feinstein, I believe, did say that marijuana is prohibited. Not that it's not kosher, because kosher really talks about whether something is permitted for eating or not, right? Then you could ask, well, what about edibles? But the plant itself, it's not a kosher problem. If it was going to be contained in a brownie or something, that brownie would have to be made kosher. The bigger issue there was when the great Rav Moshe Feinstein was giving rulings, marijuana was illegal, okay, and the law of the land is halacha, right? So you're not allowed to do things that are illegal in the country where you reside. So when marijuana became legal, then that ruling, was it vacated? No. Do some people who are religious people, smoke marijuana? Yes. But that's a complicated question, and definitely one that you want to discuss with your rabbi, and what it would mean for you, and what are the issues with your mental faculty, and what could be harmed or not, etc. So if you're asking about vaping marijuana, it's a more complicated question. If you're asking about vaping, nicotine, that's a different question. Certainly a lot of religious Jews smoke cigarettes and vape, but certainly not all do, and a lot of people would say that's very harmful. The cigarette is very harmful. Vaping, some say, is much less harmful than tobacco. Others say we don't really know yet. The microparticulates of vaping, we don't really know. All the data is not in yet. So I am not a rabbi. I'm the furthest thing from a poskening rabbi. I am not giving you rulings. I'm not telling you don't do something. I'm not telling you should do something, that you can do something. You can't get that from me. I'm not a rabbi. So if these questions are of interest, talk to your rabbi. There is a lot of information online, but don't just go to the first website you found online that gives you the answer you want, right? You might need to take a deeper dive than that to investigate the laws on these kinds of questions. That's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we're together again tomorrow, Wednesday, special time for tomorrow only, noon Pacific tomorrow, Wednesday, because we're going away.